right, good morning and happy Friday. We're a little bit of a smaller group today since I know we have some people that are traveling and also people that for whatever reason need to join us remotely. So welcome, glad to have you here. I understand that today there's some opportunities for COVID testing on campus. So if that's something you decide is useful or helpful for you to do, definitely encourage you to seek that out. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the major ideas for today, some reminders, and get into where we left off on what it means to listen and to participate in small groups. I know we've got several folks joining us through Zoom, so we'll ask you to join us in an activity a little bit later. As a reminder, your group membership reflection assignment is due next Wednesday by midnight. So this assignment is asking you to, again, think about a group that you're currently a member of or you have been a member of in the past. It could be an extracurricular sports team. It could be a group of friends, although preferably a group that has more of like a professional or organizational purpose. And I'm asking you again to think about your own role within the group and some of the ways that your group is able to communicate. Again, this is a really short assignment. It's only 2 pages, double space. So it's not a big, scary writing assignment. I like to use this to give you some early quarter feedback on your writing and to help you prepare for some of the longer writing assignments later in the class. In order to help you to prepare for this assignment, and since I know that it can be a little bit hard to find some of the information, I went ahead and posted on Canvas announcements and also on the slide the full APA citation for the textbook that we use in this class. So again, full APA site is right here. If you want to, you can just copy paste it and put it in your works cited. Boom, done. The only other thing you'll need to do is make sure that whenever you're quoting or paraphrasing, right, if it's outside of your common knowledge or information that is your personal experience, right, you'll want to include an in-text cite, including the page number. So for instance, if you're talking about the self-perception inventory and the different types of group membership, right? You want to include this site followed by the page number. So I definitely recommend reviewing some of these readings and just taking note of some of the pages that discuss some of these ideas and concepts to help you to prepare. So that's there for you, and again, designed to help. I'm happy again to look at rough drafts, outlines. Ideally, if you're going to send me something in advance, please get that to me by Monday so that I can help and turn around feedback to you in a way that's useful. I also have my office hours if you have any questions or need help on this too. So last class, we talked about listening, right? And purpose and goals of listening when you're a member of a small group, right? Listening is more than just hearing and physically picking up on things, right? It's this multi-stage process where you're perceiving, you're making sense of information, you're recalling it, right? And you're critically thinking and evaluating it. Who's saying this? Why? What makes this message important? We also talked about how we can develop good strategies of listening in small groups. Yeah, guys.
I have a question about group membership reflection.
Yes.
How many pages?
So it's 2 pages, double space, the works cited.
For the content?
Yes, yes. So the content, the writing itself would be about 2 pages. And I do have like the longer prompt as well as the rubric to help you follow along. It's kind of a checklist as you're working through. Good question. So we also talked about listening, right, in small groups, some of the ways that we can do so effectively. We'll build on those things a little bit more. And our group activity last class was helping us sort of listen to each other, right? I asked you to think about your own perspective on social media and then to really listen and take notes on what other people in your group were doing. We've been doing several of these kind of small group activities, and we're doing another one today. Later in the quarter, I will be asking you to complete an assignment where you reflect on some of our in-class activities and participation and how you see yourself as a member of these small groups. So just have that on your radar. Again, listening, right, is really about engaging with our senses to pick up on information. We talked last class about how this isn't really listening because even though the fellow over here is physically hearing, right, he's down on his phone, there's nonverbal communication that she's doing on the right that he's not picking up on and following. right? So listening involves a lot of different parts. There's a class we offer at EOU called Are You Listening? A couple folks that are already in it, but it's a way that we can talk about some of these ideas in more detail. Active listening, again, is the idea that you're making this really agentic choice to participate and to understand a message. This is really important when we're in small groups, because oftentimes, if you're placed in a group with other students, right, or a group of people and you feel like you're on other planets and you don't know each other, listening is a way that we can get on the same page and ultimately get something done. We've all felt frustration when there's somebody in a group who hasn't pulled their weight, right? And listening and creating good listening is a way to help get on the same page and deal with that. So again, paraphrasing, clarifying questions, providing feedback that's constructive and appropriate is the way to be a good listener. This class, in addition to talking through some of the ways that we can create good listening through our own preparation, right? We'll talk about pre-listening and how we can create a listenable environment for people before we even start, right? Because listening and that whole stage of listening begins before we even enter the small group. We'll also talk about some good and bad practices. And our third group activity is a scenario where I'll be asking you to think about how to use pre-listening to help your own group. So one idea, right, that we were starting to hit on is that listening is something that happens in a lot of different contexts, right? Listening is oftentimes something we think of face-to-face when you're physically talking and seeing somebody else, but listening does happen digitally too, right? And when we listen digitally and use digital media, including folks that are engaging through Zoom, right, there's a lot of unique challenges. My other class, there's somebody who mentioned that it's a lot harder to focus and to pay attention on Zoom for a lot of different reasons. One of them is you have this flat 2D space, little rectangle, where there's less opportunity to pick up on the nonverbal cues of somebody else that you can do in 3D, right? Another reason is if you're talking to somebody, yes, your mind can wander, yes, you can lose focus, you get on your phone, but there's fewer distractions available, right? If you're on Zoom for a class, there's a good chance that you're multitasking, right? You have different tabs open, you're answering your emails. Maybe you just like put your phone or laptop out and you're doing the laundry, right? As you're paying attention to or listening to a Zoom meeting, right? So listening happens digitally and there's a lot of challenges with distraction that can come up there, right? There's more opportunities for us to get off task. And again, because we think faster than other people speak, we have a lot more opportunity for those distractions to overwhelm us. So it can happen synchronously, but listening also happens, right, through asynchronous communication, things such as text, email, and so on, right? You might think about the groups that you're a part of. One of the ways that a lot of groups communicate, including folks that have brought up in class, is that they'll use things such as group chat. And that can be useful, right? It can help you take the time to think about and develop a response. A lot of people like things like email or text because they get to see the response and figure out what they're going to say and delete and edit and so on before they do it, right? But you also miss out on the immediate response and feedback that you get through synchronous communication, right? If somebody says, hey, how are you today? And somebody kind of sighs and rolls their eyes and is like, I had a rough day, right? That hits different than saying, oh, I had a rough day in a text message. A couple other ideas that I think are really helpful to think about when it comes to listening, right? You can think about listening as kind of like a dance, right? Where there's a constant give and take between you and the other person. That gets at the idea of sender-receiver reciprocity, right? Or the idea that you were simultaneously listening and being heard, right? That you have to provide, respond in a way that really gives back what you've been given in listening, right? Listening can be taxing and challenging. So the idea here is that by being a good listener, right, and by creating a message that can be heard and understood well, that there's this mutual support and creation of meaning together, right? So there's a lot of examples, including in media, that we see of really bad listening, right? People getting off task and not being able to focus, right? I recently started watching the show on Hulu, Only Murders in the Building, and there's a scene where there's two people on a date, right? The one person tells kind of their life story and a very serious, challenging thing that happened in their life. The other character kind of defends himself and does a lot of nonverbal communication and doesn't reciprocate. He doesn't tell a story back. She gets frustrated and says, like, hey, I created a story, I shared my story, the expectation is that you do that too, right? Oftentimes we have a lot of situations where we're demanding the same from the other person that we give to them. We disclose and share details about ourselves, we expect them to do the same, and that back and forth is an important part of creating good communication. Another key idea here, right, is social decentering. Again, that goes back to the Atticus Finch, put yourself in somebody else's shoes. But it's the idea that as a listener, it's not all about you, right? It's about understanding where that person comes from. You can find points of similarity. Oh, hey, I went to the same middle school, but maybe your friend went through that middle school in a very different year, a very different time in their life. So making space for difference is really important in effective communication. Another key idea, and something that we're going to be hitting upon in just a little bit with our next activity, is the idea of pre-listening, right? So to create a good space where we can listen and to understand each other, it has to happen before the small group even meets or works together. Again, there's a good chance if you're part of an extracurricular or athletic group that you've signed some type of handbook or agreement or contract or had a meeting with a coach, right? And in that meeting, you've probably created some sort of standards for conduct, rules about how you as teammates treat each other, right? Maybe you have this rule that you don't make fun of or criticize your teammates. Back when I did speech and debate, we had a rule called band talk, right? Where when we were competing at a tournament, right, and we had so many people from other schools, our rule was that we couldn't trash talk or speak negatively about other teams or competitors while we were at the tournament as much as we wanted to, right? But once we got back to our van or back to our car that we were going to use to drive back to the hotel, then all bets are off, and then we can like vent and say whatever the heck we want, right? But pre-listening deals with the idea that we're creating those boundaries and parameters ahead of time to prevent something like somebody overhearing us saying negative things about others. So pre-listening, right, means that we're doing a lot of steps for preparation. It means that we're creating a good physical location. For instance, right, if you are interested in interviewing somebody for a job, one thing you might think about is how you're arranging the physical space and tables. Where is the person being interviewed going to sit? Where are you all going to sit? Are you all sitting in places where you can hear and see that person effectively? Is the interviewee somebody who's able to clearly see and listen to everybody there too, right? If you're doing a Zoom meeting, does everybody have their audio working? Are there mics on, right? Those are things to check in about in managing the location. Listening tasks is another key idea here, right? So for instance, in your group, you might ask people to listen to or to pay attention to different things. So again, if somebody's doing something like a job interview, one person in the group might be assigned to really focus on some of the ways that they meet the qualifications for the job. Do they seem qualified? Another might look at things such as their character. Do they seem like a person that's trustworthy and would be good at the job? So maybe you have different people in the group who are listening to different things or highlighting different things as part of their approach. Listening norms is a really important idea, right? If you're in a group and your group is maybe working together on a school assignment, maybe you make an agreement that everybody has to put their phones away. That way, that can create a norm or culture where people are able to listen to each other a little bit better. The idea of contextual barriers gets us to the role of culture and high and low context culture. Does somebody want to take a stab at like what the difference is between a low and a high context culture? Yeah, Haley.
High context cultures are when it's based off of like strict morality rules, like the Japanese cultures are high context cultures. A lot of the Asian Americans are high context cultures, where America is low context. It's very like subtle, very like a lot of like kind of just do what you want. Actually, I think it's switched.
Right, it is switched. So, but no, you were on the right track, because right, high context means there's a lot of subtext, right? Countries such as Japan, right? You mentioned there's higher context. It means that there's more subtlety. There's like these unwritten rules. You don't say no if you don't want something. You say maybe, or I'm not sure, right? Because it's more polite. And lower context cultures, right? It's more direct. So that's an important consideration when you're in a group, right? Is making sure that your group is addressing those barriers. That, for instance, if you come from a larger family or a culture where people are always talking and filling in the space, it's saying, hey, it's okay if we have some moments of silence, think about or take notes or observe what's happening. So getting everybody on the same page matters. Biases, right, matter a lot, especially when we're thinking about the credibility, right? Things such as gender, race, age, nationality, disability, and so on can play a role in biases, even if we don't assume that they will at first, right? So that's important for us to recognize. One other idea is to think about whether to take notes or to record ahead of time. Oftentimes, you'll tell the interviewee ahead of time, hey, you're going to be recorded. Is that okay? When I interviewed for this job, I found out like right before the interview that they were going to turn video off. So I got all dressed up and ready to go. 5 minutes before, they were like, no, it's just going to be audio. But that was a way that folks agreed to have that interview happen, right? They created that parameter. And then also think about breaks, right? If you're in a group and you feel like you're just stuck for hours and hours, you're like looking at the clock and your stomach's rumbling, right? You're going to get off focus. If you know that there are breaks that come up every like half hour, then you're going to feel a lot more engaged, because you know that you can prepare for that. And you don't have to worry about things ending. So there's a lot of good practices of listening. We've talked through a lot of these already, so I'm not going to go through them in a whole lot of detail. But again, the idea, one of the key ideas here is that if there are moments of silence, people are taking notes or trying to understand a message, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. That taking the time to really observe and reflect is good. Thinking about purpose, why are we here? What is our goal of listening? Helps us to engage. The level, right, or the way that people are conveying a message matters a whole lot too. The significance of major ideas, right, is another key component. So you have to figure out, if you're hiring somebody, what is important? What are the things that that person needs to bring to the table? Again, urging less dominant people to speak. Usually when we're in a group, there's one or two people that will take charge and do a lot of the talking and fill a lot of the space. But facilitating a good group means saying something like, hey, I haven't heard from you in a while, or I'm curious to hear your perspective, and making space to somebody so that they can address issues. Nonverbal, again, responding to and paying attention to nonverbal communication matters a lot, right? If somebody crosses their arms and gets really defensive in answer to a question, that's an important thing to highlight. It tells you maybe they're less comfortable or more uneasy. Interactive questions are a good idea, right? Asking questions, they're open-ended, that let people really talk through an issue is important. For instance, if you're on like a newspaper or radio show, right? You come in and maybe you say, okay, everybody, what are some of your ideas, right? You create this open, interactive environment that people talk through. Using tentative and confirming statements is a good idea. So you would say this is a good plan, right? Those types of questions or phrases can help us to get on the same page and to make sure we understand. Generally, we should avoid interruption, right? It's a good idea to be clear and to let somebody say what they need to say. But if you know somebody's getting off base in particular, you've got limited time, you can interrupt or redirect the conversation if it's appropriate to do that. Paraphrasing is saying in your own words, or responding, right, is providing verbal and nonverbal feedback. And again, leaving that time for silence to really think through and understand the message, especially considering the role of culture, right? English might not be the first language for everybody. And so letting people really understand and make sense of the message so that people aren't left behind is a good idea. So there's kind of a running trope and meme, right, in a lot of spaces, such as sharing kind of academic or scholarly work. So whenever I go to a conference, right, there's a Q&A where people are asked questions about the research. And a running gag is when somebody raises their hand and says something that's really more of a statement than a question, right? They're like, well, I wouldn't have done this research in this way. What do you think about that, right? It's not really a question. And so that can be a challenge of being a good listener, is asking questions that make it about you and don't really focus on the content. So listening is good, right? Taking time for silence is good. But if there's no time to respond or you don't do anything with listening, it, of course, can be a dead end, right? If it's just hearing information and not doing anything with it, right, that's a bad idea. If you're a group working together and maybe you have a special guest who's talking about how to use new technology in your group, right? The expectation is that the group talks about that and does something with it rather than just taking that information in and moving on. Listening behavior of other people. So if somebody is rolling their eyes or on their phone or asleep, right, that does not necessarily give you permission to do the same. So don't like homogenize your listening too much if you see people listening in a way that is different than what you should be doing. Cutting off, right, or putting down somebody, making fun of them is not a good idea when they're speaking. Again, if there's an interruption that makes sense, you can do that, but interruption that doesn't make sense or doesn't help people in the group is a problem. Again, counterfeit questions are more statements than questions. They're questions that aren't really about trying to support or understand a message. They're more about making a statement and giving it a question mark to be passive aggressive. Tone, right? Tone matters, but if you let the tone and the style of speaking over focus compared to the message itself, that can be a problem. And while it's good to express your own idea and perspective on what you're hearing, if you let your interpretation, you know, I really thought your message was great. It reminded me of this time about a week ago when I was walking my dog, right? You get off topic. So you can focus on understanding and clarifying the message. If you focus too much on what that message meant for you in a group, right? It makes it about yourself in a way that generally is not a good idea. So what I want us to do now is using some of the things that we've talked about in terms of reading good and listenable messages. I'm going to have us have two groups that are here face-to-face and then a group on Zoom. In this scenario, your group members are all working for a local newspaper company, and your group is interviewing candidates for a position as a new writer. So as part of this interview, right, you all are going to work together and figure out what you're going to do to create a listenable environment for your job candidates. So how will you use pre-listening to create a good space for those interview candidates to make their case and to talk to you? For instance, you might talk about how members of your group are taking on specific roles to prepare for that interview. Again, we've talked about some of the ways that pre-listening can help to create an environment so that when the person goes in, right, they feel comfortable and able to talk to you. And then once you do that, assume that the candidates are being interviewed through Zoom, and also talk through how you create a positive and listenable environment online as well. So I want one person for each of the groups to write or type, including the names. Your answers to those questions, I will ask the groups to share. And again, try to focus on as specifically as possible what you would do, how you would manage the physical space to create an environment in that job interview where you could create good listening. So Looks like we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 will be a group. 1, 2, 3, and 4 as a group. And then we'll have 4 people on Zoom. So I will create the breakout room for these folks right now. Again, have 1 person per group who will write or type. And then I'll also ask that 1 person per group shares as well. Folks on Zoom, all the slides are also on Canvas, so you're welcome to refer back to that for this prompt too.
Yeah, like one big breakout room that is smaller, or so one room where everyone like can co-mingle, and then break it into like a smaller room, so you have individual time to interview to make sure you have like that face-to-face, like real conversation. We try to get like perspective on who they are, so they realize their workers, and then also to them in the social setting around summer school. But yeah, definitely one-on-one. Yeah, and we try to like one up each other. Yeah. It'd be good if maybe one more closer. It's better to do a recording because it's just like look at the time. Like I really not really thinking. You know, about what it is. Exactly. So I think it would be better to record than to type for guides.
Yeah, this time of 3 hours, just type it.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, Professor, I got kicked from the group. Would you be able to put me back in it?
Yep.
Thank you.
You probably want to take like one intermission. Yeah, like just one like 10-minute like. Right now I have managing physical locations and we're going to report every time. Do you want to determine how often to take breaks? Yeah, so we want Like, I mean, the only thing that we want to see is the top. So our business book is a business where they have them tell a personal story about their life in the very beginning of it, just to see like if they like it's meaningful if they you know, you can pick up a lot of person. You pick up a lot of person. You have them on the spot come up with something how to yeah. What you know about it, something different.
Maybe some newspaper companies, like, see how big their goals is, give everyone the same story, see what all the.
Ooh, I like that. I would write a little paragraph of it. I feel like very used to this. I love the technology for it. Would be something that you feel like the individuality, like in our reality, everyone's going to get a story. And his job is to get a story. How do we like process who we want and who we don't want? And what are we looking for? I'm just looking at about the life. Yeah. The breakout rooms. Have them all in group, doing activities. Each one of these breakout rooms.
I think about 5 more minutes on this.
Can you get this how they work in like the students and like that? So like team building activities. Yeah. Let's talk about it. And first, people were earlier, so it sounds like the cameras on. It was stuff I want her to have to plastic, at least on its face, you know? Yes, yeah. I would understand. Maybe you should have their phones. Yeah. Because that is one of my pet peeves with people are talking, even talking. Yes. But you can't. Especially when we're trying to like get direct attention for someone. Very good to do yourself, but yeah, I'm probably not trying to multitask with people. You can't multitask if you're playing and the other one. So if you do some care, then that's like you're not your head to jump. It's like, dude, I went round 3 and then heartbreak. Yeah. It makes sense for the company. So the group scene, you always like start with the scene and then go in person. Not like the job I got for the summer. And do the phone interview. And then do an interview and then the other job. Dude, I had like 5 interviews for my summer internship. Now oh my god. And I ended up not even taking it because I was in the best home. But I got it.
So let's go ahead and chat about this together. Again, I'd like to hear from each group in as much detail as you can. This first answer, how you're using pre-listening and painting a picture for us about what that environment looks like for the job candidate, and then also how that would look a little bit different digitally. So let's start with the group on Zoom. Feel free to share what you all talked about in addressing these questions.
So what we talked about for the first question for the face-to-face interview is initially just setting up the right environment. We mentioned dressing appropriately because professionalism is large in job interviews, but also having the room set in a way where the candidates in the interviews are directly across from each other and, you know, facing each other. That way you can pick up on cues and, you know, just read the person's face as well. And another a member of my group mentioned to face both parties away from any windows or distractions because that can be an issue. To recognize biases, we decided that maybe requiring a resume beforehand, so they can read over it, decide if they even want to interview. And most places do this, but so you can see if you even want to interview this person or candidate. And another one was to assign jobs among the interviewers for what they're listening for. For example, like maybe one person's writing down notes or listening to what they're saying, and another person is picking up on cues on how they're saying it and how they're going about, mentioning the information. And lastly, we said to have effective breaks between each candidate to refresh the listening among the interviewers. For the second one for Zoom, we decided to talk about proper Zoom etiquette with like good lighting, no phones, no background or outside noises, and have your cameras on, especially in an interview setting. That's very important. Again, requiring a resume, maybe even some additional background information, because maybe you're not meeting this person in person, and it's just good to get a good idea, feel of what they're like. And lastly, having a backup plan if technical difficulties arise.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing. I think your group brought in some really good points about how to create a good environment, right, for people who both face-to-face and digitally are participating in something like an interview. I like the way you bring up the issue of distractions, right? If somebody's being interviewed, they're probably very anxious and they really are going to focus on that. But for the people asking questions, taking notes, right, it could be easy for them to get distracted, to look out the window, to not pay attention. And when those situations happen, the person being interviewed suddenly feels like they're not being respected or cared about in the same way. They might start to second guess if they're asking or if they're answering good questions and making a good impression, right? So the people doing the interviewing need to definitely be showing themselves as engaged and prepared. I like the way you bring up addressing things like tech issues through Zoom, right? One challenge if you ever use a platform like Zoom for anything like a job interview, group communication, is to be really careful about hosting and about what things are available, right? It's the worst experience to have a small group and have somebody who's trying to share a screen, but the host is disabled screen sharing or disabled using attachments in the chat. Free listening on Zoom means going into Zoom and like ahead of time modifying it so that it has certain permissions available if your group does need to do things like screen share, attach files, and all of that. So I really appreciate you all bringing up and discussing some of those elements. Here's some group here on this side.
So first of all, ahead of time, our interviewees will prepare a small story or a old interview to show us their writing and reporting style. For the face-to-face interview, we will have it in an office with 4 of us sitting in front of our candidate. The 4 of us will be listening to different parts of our candidate's interview. One person will be listening non-verbally, another person will be listening credibility, others will be listening to various other reasons. We will ask to record the interview, and everyone will be taking notes on different things. So whether that's also, again, nonverbal communication or that is how they present themselves and how they speak. Breaks will not be necessary because hopefully these interviews will only go a half-hour long, and because we have a strict half-hour time limit, all of our interviewees will have a 4-minute window to answer each question along with an additional minute if needed. So someone will be on the clock at all times. Over the computer, we will have video on. Mics will be muted unless speaking to avoid hot mic incidences. The next person with a question or with a follow-up will use the raise their hand feature. Same deal as face-to-face when it comes to recording and taking notes. If the interviewee cannot hear the question or the audio quality is poor on the interviewer side, all future questions and all future follow-up questions will be typed into the chat. And same deal with time.
So this is super organized, and definitely a good model that has some really clear guidelines and expectations for how people are going to work together on the interview, right? I really like the way that you're designating time slots for questions, the way you're creating etiquette, including having mics muted during something like a digital interview. These are all really good points to think about in terms of letting people have space. And I also like how both the Zoom group and this one have brought up the way that you can use pre-listening through having prepared material, information about the candidates and so on, that helps make sure that things go smoothly once they're actually physically there. So, model you all talked about is having one person focus on different things within the interview, like nonverbal communication. This is a model we actually see a lot. If you ever find yourself interviewing people, oftentimes one person per group would be assigned a particular question or maybe a couple questions, right? And are really focused on response to that particular question. So maybe somebody is really interested in a question about prior work experience, or a question about how you handle difficult situations, or a question about how you handle diversity. So, delegating in that way on listening can be a really great way to capture the whole message. Leslie, let's hear from you.
So we talked about how we manage physical location, a large room where they can mingle, and then a smaller breakout room for individuals. We would then choose to record over type. So whoever's typing can focus on what's going on instead of having to constantly be typing away. And we decided we would make the interview for 2 hours with 1 10-minute intermission, just to mingle, grab a snack, water, etc. And then we would have them impromptu write an excerpt about a news line that you tell them to see the quality of their work in high stress situations, just to kind of test how they do in situations and get them actively participating in what we want them to do in our fear film. The room has to have no cell phones out and be rather quiet when writing, to make sure they have their space and time to slow down and really get quality work out to us. One thing we said was it needs to not rely on references and previous work, but rather looking at the person as an individual breakout room for personal interviews, and group setting, how they work with others, doing team building activities to test emotional intelligence and intellectual intelligence. And then for Zoom, we would want them to have both the camera and volume on at all times, so that way they can't multitask while they're in the interview, and just to see how attentive they are to actually wanting the job and the different aspects of who they are as a person, because you can really tell when someone doesn't care versus when they really do care about what they're doing. And then we also said if it was on Zoom, we would want to do multiple rounds of interviewing, just so you didn't get the one-time facade of them.
Yeah.
It's easier to fake the facade on one time on Zoom than in person.
Yeah. At least before COVID, right, there was a fairly common model where a first round would happen through Zoom, and then a second round would happen face-to-face, right, or over the phone. So thanks, Haley. I think your group brought in some really good points about how to structure, and I really like the prompts that you all bring in about how to have candidates prepare. Some of the on-the-fly thinking can be a lot of fun for getting more information, figuring out how a candidate can do. So I really like that being brought to the table. I also am noticing between groups there's a lot of differences in how time is being managed and allocated, right? One thing to think about is how much time is physically available to you? How much time are you going to give to candidates? And another question that might come up, right, is talking about interruption. To what degree do you interrupt people if they're getting off task or off focus in answering questions? Or how much do you cut people off if they're running up against the time limit, right? So those are important considerations, because managing time, physical space, pacing yourself is really important. Creating maybe a little bit of a buffer of time between interviews can really help for that too. So thank you all for sharing. I thought you brought in some really good points about the ways that you create, again, that physical space or that digital space for understanding and listening and following messages. So to wrap up for today, we talked a little bit about pre-listening, right? Creating that good space for people to communicate and understand each other in a group ahead of time. We talked about some of the good practices and bad practices of listening, avoiding those belligerent statements that aren't really questions, focusing on nonverbal cues and so on, and about how listening can really help improve our communication and our understanding of one another as we participate in groups too. So after this weekend, we'll be getting into intercultural communication and international communication, and the ways that things such as culture, identity, nationality, race, and so on impact the way that we engage and understand one another. So go ahead and email or send me those assignments for today if you haven't done so already for your group. I only need one per group. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all again on Monday.